Imagine this. Two officers armed with authority and ready to make a routine arrest. But what they don't know is that the woman they're about to arrest has a powerful secret. And that secret will completely change the course of their lives, and they won't even see it coming. It all began on a sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park was alive with the sounds of children playing, joggers pacing along the trail, and families picnicking under the shade of tall oak trees. Amid this peaceful scene, Camille sat alone on a bench near the pond, enjoying a rare moment of quiet. A thick hardcover book rested on her lap as she immersed herself in its pages, losing herself in the world of words. But in a moment, her calm was shattered. The sharp screech of tires echoed through the park, grabbing her attention. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, catching the eyes of a few onlookers. Out stepped two officers, their expressions stern, radiating authority. They immediately locked eyes with Camille, the only person sitting alone in the vicinity. Something about her caught their attention. Maybe it was the fact that she was sitting alone, or maybe it was something else, but they were about to make a decision that would change everything. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" one of the officers called out, his voice carrying suspicion rather than concern. Camille glanced up from her book, her demeanor calm and composed. "Of course," she replied, carefully closing her book. The second officer moved closer, his tone clipped as he said, "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" "Suspicious activity?" Camille raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "I'm just sitting here reading," she replied, holding up the book as if to prove her point. But the officers didn't seem convinced. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded, his words thick with condescension. Camille's pulse quickened slightly, but she remained calm. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" she asked, the irritation barely masked in her voice. "It's routine," the second officer said, though his tone made it clear that he wasn't asking her out of routine concern. This felt different. The small crowd that had gathered started to murmur among themselves. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, others stood in stunned silence, sensing the imbalance in the interaction. Camille felt the weight of their eyes on her. She sighed, then reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. With steady hands, she handed over her driver's license to the officer. He took it, scanning the information with unnecessary intensity. "Camille Johnson," he read aloud, almost mockingly. "What's your business here, Miss Johnson?" Her patience was wearing thin, but Camille remained composed. She took a deep breath and answered, "I live in this city. I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" The officer didn't answer her directly. Instead, he handed her ID back, but didn't walk away. He and the other officer lingered, continuing to ask questions that felt more like an interrogation than a routine check. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" one officer sneered. "Are you alone here or waiting for someone?" The other added, his hand resting deliberately on his belt, a posture that made the situation feel more threatening. Camille had dealt with many tense situations in courtrooms, but this one felt different. The power dynamic was unmistakable. The officers were in control. She was at their mercy. But Camille knew better than to show any sign of fear or weakness. She had handled tough situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about the law. It was about a system that saw her as suspicious because of the color of her skin. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly, standing her ground. And that's when things took a sharp turn. The first officer stepped closer. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." "I know the law," Camille replied, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But reason wasn't part of the agenda for these officers. They had already decided that she was a threat, and now they were about to escalate things. The first officer's hand shot out, grabbing Camille's arm. "You're resisting," he stated, even though Camille hadn't moved an inch. "What are you doing?" Camille exclaimed, her voice sharp with disbelief. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some people started pulling out their phones, recording the scene as the tension escalated. Camille could feel her heart racing, but she tried to stay calm. This wasn't the first time she had been confronted by an unjust situation, but it was the first time it was happening to her, a woman who had spent years fighting for justice. "Stop resisting!" the officer barked, as if performing for the growing audience. His voice rose, projecting a sense of authority he seemed eager to wield. Camille's stomach twisted with humiliation and anger. The injustice of it all burned in her chest as the cold, unforgiving metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. She tried to hold herself together, but the shame of being treated like a criminal, despite doing nothing wrong, left her speechless. The officers marched her toward their cruiser, ignoring the questions from the onlookers. Some were trying to understand what was happening. Others were outraged at the blatant injustice. But Camille couldn't pay attention to them now. She turned her head slightly and locked eyes with a young woman in the crowd, holding up her phone. There was an unspoken exchange between them, a silent plea to document the injustice unfolding before them. Camille gave a brief nod. She knew that this wouldn't be the end. This moment would be a part of something much bigger. As the door of the police cruiser slammed shut behind her, Camille sat in the back seat, her mind racing. She had spent years defending clients, standing up for the law, and navigating the legal system. Now she was on the other side of it, the victim of a system that was supposed to protect her but had instead betrayed her. The absurdity of the situation struck her, but there was no humor in it, only anger. The ride to the station was suffocatingly silent, save for the crackle of the police radio. Camille stared out the window, her reflection blending with the passing scenery. Her wrists ached from the handcuffs, the tight metal biting into her skin. She replayed the events in her mind, wondering how something as simple as sitting in a park could spiral so quickly into this nightmare. The answer was painfully clear: prejudice. It was that simple. When they arrived at the station, things only worsened. The booking process was invasive, humiliating, and dehumanizing. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and then shoved into a small holding cell with buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. "Enjoy your stay," one of the officers said smugly as he slammed the door shut behind her. Camille sat down on the cold bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The humiliation was overwhelming, but it was also fuel for the fire burning inside her. She wasn't going to let this slide. She had the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back. And that's exactly what she was going to do. Hours passed before anyone acknowledged her again. A young officer approached her cell with a clipboard, his voice flat as he relayed the charges. "Miss Johnson, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he said, almost as if he were reading from a script. Camille's voice was sharp, laced with frustration. "On what grounds?" she demanded. "You can discuss that in court," he replied dismissively before turning away. She exhaled slowly, her mind calculating the next steps. The charges were weak. Camille knew that. But what was to come next? The fight ahead wasn't going to be easy. Cases like hers rarely were. But Camille had faced harder challenges in courtrooms. This was just one more she would overcome. Eventually, Camille was released on bail, and as she stepped out of the station into the cool night air, she felt a momentary relief. The suffocating atmosphere inside had been replaced with a sense of freedom. Her colleague and close friend Marissa was waiting by the curb, her face a mixture of concern and relief. "Camille!" Marissa called, rushing over. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Camille said, though her voice betrayed her with a slight tremor. The words felt hollow. Nothing about this situation was fine, but she didn't have time to dwell on that. Not yet. As they drove away, Marissa glanced at her, her voice hesitant. "What are you thinking?" Camille's grip tightened on the seat, her jaw clenched with determination. "I'm not letting this slide, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight back," Camille replied firmly. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources, and I'm going to use them." That night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads, open books, and her laptop. She worked tirelessly, outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from a simmering determination. She wouldn't let them win. She would make sure that their actions had consequences. As the days turned into weeks, Camille's case gained traction in the community. The video of her arrest, shared by the young woman who had recorded the scene at the park, went viral. It spread like wildfire, drawing attention from people across the country and sparking an outpouring of support. Camille's phone was flooded with messages of solidarity, stories of others who had faced similar injustice, and words of encouragement. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, humiliated, and dismissed by a system that too often turned a blind eye. The public response gave Camille strength, but it also brought new pressures. The law firm where she worked was initially hesitant about her public case. They feared that it might overshadow their carefully cultivated reputation, but Camille wasn't swayed. She understood the stakes. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for change. She needed to hold the officers accountable, and she needed to expose the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. Despite the pressure, Camille's resolve only grew stronger. Every time she received an email or a phone call from someone sharing their own story of injustice, it pushed her to work harder, to fight even harder. She wasn't backing down. But as the case progressed, Camille found herself in a place she never expected. The officers involved in her arrest, Carter and Daniels, filed a motion to dismiss the case, a standard tactic used to delay proceedings. Camille had anticipated this move. It was predictable, part of the game that those in power often played to avoid accountability. But what came next was something Camille never could have predicted. One day, her attorney called with news. "Camille, you should know something," he said cautiously, his voice betraying a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The words hit Camille like a thunderclap. For a moment, she couldn't process what he had said. She had spent weeks preparing to fight these officers in court, and now, fate had handed her an entirely different kind of justice. She was going to be the one presiding over a case involving these same officers, Carter and Daniels, the officers who had humiliated her, arrested her unjustly, and treated her with prejudice. The irony of it was staggering. At first, Camille wasn't sure how to feel about this new development. Could she do it? Could she sit on that bench and remain impartial? The emotions swirled within her, but one thought kept rising to the surface. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was an opportunity, a chance to show what real justice looked like. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet murmurs as people filed in, finding their seats. For most, the case Camille was presiding over seemed like just another internal misconduct hearing, involving two officers accused of using excessive force in an unrelated incident. But to those who knew the backstory, to the community that had rallied around Camille, this was far more than just another case. This was the moment that could change everything. Officer Carter and Officer Daniels sat at the defendant's table, their faces stone cold, their eyes darting nervously between each other. Their expressions were indifferent at first, almost bored. This was just another day to them, just another hurdle to clear, another case to brush aside. They had no idea what was coming. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room fell silent. Camille stepped onto the bench, her black robe flowing behind her as she moved with purpose. She was calm, composed, but there was something undeniable in the air. The tension was palpable. When Camille took her seat, she glanced briefly toward the defendants. Officer Carter's face drained of color, his eyes widening in shock. His jaw tightened, and his body stiffened. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Officer Daniels' reaction was much the same, his disbelief evident as he tried to process the situation. It was her, the woman they had arrested, humiliated, and treated with unjust suspicion in the park. The woman they thought would be powerless was now the one holding the power in the courtroom. Camille allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room, before speaking in a calm, steady voice. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat stiffly, their composure faltering. Officer Carter whispered something to their lawyer, who nodded but kept his eyes fixed on Camille. It was clear now. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone, but Camille wasn't here for revenge. She was here to ensure justice, and she would do so with the impartiality demanded by her role as a judge. Her job was to listen to the facts and apply the law, regardless of her personal feelings. Still, the tension in the room was undeniable. The officers, once so sure of their actions, now felt the uncomfortable weight of their past decisions hanging over them. As the attorneys presented their opening arguments, Camille maintained her professionalism. She listened intently, taking notes as the case unfolded. But even as she focused on the legal details every so often, her gaze would flicker toward the officers. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way they fidgeted, the unease that was starting to seep into their confidence. During a recess, the two officers stepped into the hallway, their voices low but agitated. "How is she the judge?" Carter hissed, his frustration barely contained. "This has to be a setup," Daniels muttered, shaking his head. "It's not a setup," their lawyer interjected, his voice calm but firm. "It's a coincidence. You need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here. Your actions are." But the officers weren't listening. They were too consumed by the surreal nature of their predicament. The woman they had wronged, the woman they had treated as beneath them, was now the one who held their fate in her hands. When court resumed, Camille remained composed. She ensured the hearing proceeded fairly, listening intently to every testimony, every piece of evidence. But there was no doubt in the air now. The officers were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. At one point, Camille caught Officer Carter stealing a glance at her. His expression wasn't defiant anymore. It was something closer to regret, a flicker of realization that perhaps he had misjudged the woman he had so easily dismissed. The reality of what they had done was starting to sink in. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was thick. Camille adjourned the hearing, her gavel striking with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As the room emptied, Camille lingered at her bench, organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of the officers' stares as they hesitated by the door, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. For Camille, the real challenge wasn't in the irony of the moment. It was in the decisions that would follow, the choices she would make as a judge, and whether true justice could prevail. The courtroom was packed the next morning. News of the unexpected twist had spread, drawing a larger crowd than usual. Some people were there out of curiosity, others to support Camille. They knew her role as the judge meant she couldn't show favoritism, but they also knew that her presence represented something bigger than just a legal case. It was a moment of reckoning for everyone involved. Camille entered with the same calm, composed demeanor, her robe flowing behind her as she ascended to the bench. The attorneys wasted no time diving into their arguments. The prosecutor laid out a compelling case against the officers, presenting testimony from the victim, a young man named Ethan, who had been subjected to excessive force during a routine traffic stop. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his voice steady, "the officers' actions were not just a lapse in judgment. They were a blatant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the very people they are sworn to protect." Camille nodded, taking in every word. The defense attempted to counter, but it was clear that their arguments lacked conviction. Even the officers seemed resigned to the likely outcome. As the trial neared its conclusion, Camille had made up her mind. She would deliver a ruling that would not only hold the officers accountable, but also send a message about the importance of transparency, fairness, and the need for systemic change in law enforcement. When the time came to deliver her ruling, Camille entered the courtroom once again, her voice calm but firm. "The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, it erodes public trust and causes harm far beyond the immediate victim. This case has laid bare the consequences of such actions." She paused, her eyes scanning the room as she took in the weight of the moment. "The evidence presented has demonstrated that Officers Carter and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold. Their actions were not only unjustified, but they are indicative of a troubling pattern that must be addressed." Camille outlined the consequences: mandatory suspension without pay, participation in retraining programs, and a formal disciplinary record that would follow them. The ruling was firm but fair, striking a balance between accountability and the opportunity for reform. As she struck the gavel, Camille knew that this moment wasn't just about these two officers. It was about ensuring that change would come, and that future generations wouldn't have to face the same injustices she had. For Camille, the fight for justice was far from over, but moments like this reminded her that real change was possible, and with every step she took, she would continue to lead the charge.